Welcome back to Story for Night Sleep. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Now get comfortable, relax your body, and let's begin. Story 1. Luke arrived at the boutique hotel just after dusk. The streets of the Paris outskirts were empty, damp with rain, the streetlights flickering like tired eyes. He had booked a standard room online, one of the smaller suites on the second floor. The lobby was quiet, nearly deserted. The receptionist smiled politely, her movements precise and rehearsed. "Welcome, Monsieur Luc. Your room is room 47, she said. She handed him a key with a faint metallic clang. Luke frowned. Room 47? I thought the hotel only had 40 rooms. She paused, as if the question were expected. Some rooms are not on the map. Her eyes flicked briefly to the ceiling, then back. Enjoy your stay. Luke took the key, shrugged, and walked toward the elevator. The hallway beyond the lobby smelled faintly of old wood and candle wax. Floor numbers were normal. 1, 2, 3, until he reached the second floor. There was no room 47. Just a wall. He tried the key anyway. It fit. The lock clicked. The door swung open. Inside, the room was normal. A bed, neatly made. A wardrobe, a small desk, and a window looking out onto the rainy street below. Everything seemed ordinary. Yet the moment he stepped inside, he felt it. A subtle weight in the air, a silence that was almost watching. Luke shook his head. I must be tired, he muttered, setting his suitcase down. But the clock on the wall ticked too slowly. The shadows stretched unnaturally, and when he looked in the mirror, for a brief moment, it didn't reflect him at all. He blinked. It was normal again. Luke didn't sleep that night. Somewhere in the darkness, the room seemed to whisper his name, soft enough that he could almost convince himself he imagined it. And as he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, he realized something deeply unsettling. The room was already paying attention to him. Luke didn't leave room 47 the next morning. Something about it had unsettled him, yet drawn him in. He sat at the small desk, notebook open, trying to write. Words flowed at first, descriptions of the room, the faint scent of candle wax, the slight chill in the air. But when he looked back at the page, some sentences had changed. Words he hadn't written now appeared. He notices the shadows, but they notice him first. He rubbed his eyes, certain it was a trick of fatigue. But as the day passed, he noticed more oddities. The wardrobe door, which he swore was closed, slightly ajar when he returned from the bathroom. The window view shifting subtly, buildings that shouldn't be there, streets twisting at impossible angles, the faint sound of footsteps behind him, even when no one else was in the hotel. By evening the whispers returned, soft, indistinct in French. He could catch fragments. Luke, remember. He froze. The voice seemed to echo, not just in the air but inside his mind. Luke moved toward the mirror. His reflection blinked a fraction of a second later than he did. Wrong, but almost imperceptibly. Then it smiled. Luke staggered back. This isn't real, he whispered. A drawer in the desk opened on its own. Inside, a notebook, identical to the one he had been using. But it was filled, page after page, with his own thoughts, written before he thought them. The room was no longer just a room. It was a recording device, and it had started recording him from the moment he entered. That night, Luke couldn't sleep. Every glance at the mirror made his skin crawl. He tried covering it with a towel, but the reflection still appeared in flashes. Not quite him, not quite someone else. Sometimes it was delayed, sometimes it moved independently. Once, it even mouthed words he hadn't thought of yet. The whispers grew louder, weaving around him like threads in a web. "You see, you belong. You will stay." He tried to leave the room. The door handle wouldn't budge. The key he had tried to open it with earlier no longer fit. Panicked, he ran to the window. Outside, the streets looked normal. Then a building shifted just slightly, like reality itself was being edited. Turning back, he saw shadows curling at the corners of the room. They weren't cast by light. They moved independently, reaching just a fraction too far, brushing against objects and then disappearing. Luke backed into the desk. The notebook he had seen earlier now hovered slightly above the surface, pages fluttering as if caught in a silent wind. The words rearranged themselves. "Do not resist. We remember every thought." He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block it out. But the room knew his panic. The whispers followed his heartbeat, sinking to his fear. He understood, in a horrifying clarity, that room 47 wasn't just haunted or strange. It adapted. It watched. It learned. And now, it was starting to teach him something. Morning never truly arrived. The hotel remained dim, the daylight outside muted grey, as if filtered through a veil of fog. Luke tried once more to leave room 47, but the door wasn't the same. It was there, yes, but shifting subtly. The edges seemed slightly blurred, the handle lower than before. He reached for it, and his hand passed through the wood. Panic rose in his chest. The room wasn't keeping him trapped physically. It was keeping him trapped mentally, bending perception until he didn't trust his own senses. He staggered back. The shadows moved closer. The whispers were clearer now, forming words he could understand without translating. "Luke, stay, become part." Every object in the room began to react. The wardrobe doors clicked open and closed, pacing him. The mirror reflected angles the room didn't have. The desk seemed to tilt slightly toward him, like it was leaning in to watch. Then he noticed the walls. They were covered, almost imperceptibly, with faint etchings, lines, symbols, words. They twisted and shifted as he blinked. Luke realized he hadn't just entered a room. He had entered a living mind, and it was already aware of him. By evening, Luke had stopped trying to leave. The room had become predictable only in its unpredictability. Shadows no longer lurked in corners. They followed him, mimicking his movements almost perfectly, but always a fraction too fast, too deliberate. He tried writing in his notebook again. Words flowed easily at first. Then the letters twisted on the page, forming sentences he hadn't thought. "You are observed. Your thoughts belong." The mirror reflected more than him now. Occasionally he saw a faint second reflection, blurred and indistinct, moving independently, watching him. It even occasionally smiled when he didn't. A cold draft swept the room. The door rattled, though there was no wind. The whispers began to call out memories he hadn't shared, naming places he had been, people he had known. Luke backed into the bed. His body trembled as the realization struck. Room 47 aren't just alive. It recorded everything about anyone who entered. It learned from them. And now it was beginning to teach him, in whispers, shadows, and movements too subtle to ignore. Somewhere in the background he could hear the faint scratching of the notebook's pages flipping, on their own, and he understood with a growing sense of horror That resistance was futile. Luke noticed it first in small, subtle ways. The desk where he wrote seemed to move slightly when he wasn't looking. The window view mirrored streets he knew, but twisted them in impossible angles. The wardrobe, when opened, revealed items he didn't own: a jacket, a book, a photograph of a city he had never visited. By midnight, he realized something terrifying. The room was imitating him. Every movement he made, every gesture, every glance was copied, almost perfectly, by the shadows and reflections. The whispers grew louder. "You belong. We remember. You learn." He reached for the mirror again. The reflection didn't mimic him exactly this time. It paused, watching. Then it moved independently, pointing toward the corner where the wardrobe shifted slightly. Luke's pulse raced. He understood the pattern the room was communicating. Not with words, not with sound, but with space, shadows, and objects. Every action he took was being recorded, mirrored, analyzed. And somewhere deep in the etchings on the walls, symbols he couldn't yet comprehend were glowing faintly, responding to him. The room was no longer just a place to stay. It was a student and teacher, a mirror and a master, and Luke was trapped in its curriculum. By the third night, Luke lost track of time. The hotel outside seemed frozen. The rain that had greeted him on arrival never ended, endlessly pattering against the streets. Sunlight never came, though clocks suggested it was morning. Inside room 47, the minutes didn't pass evenly. The wall clock ticked slowly, then skipped seconds. The shadows lengthened and shortened without reason. Luke tried to keep track in his notebook, but the pages twisted. Words he had written disappeared, replaced by phrases he didn't remember composing. "Time is ours. You are ours. Learn to stay." Every sound in the room seemed intentional. The creak of the floorboards, the soft gust of air, even the hum of the lights, all synchronized to him. It was as if the room knew his rhythm and adjusted itself around him. The mirror reflected more than him now. Sometimes he would see himself standing where he wasn't, performing actions he hadn't yet made. Other times, it showed shadows stretching toward him, lingering just out of reach. He realized with a rise in dread that room 47 was no longer simply observing him. It was teaching him to obey, bending perception, twisting reality, erasing time itself until he no longer trusted what was true and what was fabricated. And outside the hotel, the streets remained silent, waiting. That night, Luke began to hear more than just his name. The whispers were fluent now, coherent enough to form sentences, though soft, almost inaudible. "Luke, remember the streets you walked, the people you feared, the choices you made." He froze. The room was reciting his memories, memories he hadn't spoken aloud, not even to himself. The mirror reflected more than just him. He saw fleeting images, rooms he had never entered, faces he didn't recognize, yet somehow felt familiar. Every blink brought new, impossible details. The wardrobe opened on its own. Inside were items from different lives, different versions of him. A pen he once lost in college, a scarf he never owned, a photograph of a city he had only dreamt of visiting. The shadows moved differently now, not merely mimicking, but anticipating his steps. They blocked paths he considered, leaned forward when he hesitated, receded only when he acted as the room wanted. Luke stumbled to the bed, clutching the notebook. Pages flipped rapidly, stopping on a passage that made his blood run cold. Do not resist. Your thoughts are ours. Your presence is part of the record. He realized the room wasn't just observing or teaching. It was absorbing him, turning him into a permanent part of its memory, its patterns, its existence. Outside, the faint rain continued, oblivious. Inside, room 47 waited patiently for its lesson to be completed. Luke sat rigid in the chair, unable to tear his eyes from the mirror. Tonight, it no longer delayed its movements. The reflection moved independently, pacing slightly behind him, then stopping, then turning to look directly at him, even though Luke himself hadn't moved. A chill ran down his spine. The whispers returned, louder now, layering over each other. You belong. You are recorded. You cannot leave. He tried speaking, demanding the room release him, but the voice in the mirror spoke before he could. Resistance is irrelevant. Integration is necessary. The wardrobe shifted again, sliding open to reveal items he recognized from his own past. A childhood toy, a notebook from years ago, a ticket stub from a forgotten train. The shadows formed shapes, pointing toward the mirror. One even raised an arm, as if to gesture at him, commanding attention. Luke stumbled back to the bed, heart hammering. The notebook lay open on its own, pages filled with passages he didn't recall writing. Observe, respond, learn, stay. He realized the horrifying truth. The room was no longer just a space. It was a teacher, a recorder, and a jailer all in one, bending time, memory, perception, until he no longer knew what was his and what was the room's. Luke didn't leave the bed that night. The room had begun to respond to his thoughts. If he imagined opening the door, the walls would stretch slightly, making the exit seem farther away. If he pictured himself running, shadows would position themselves in his path, forcing him to turn back. The whispers no longer needed words. They communicated directly, threading into his mind with impossible precision. You are learning. You are ours. Every thought, every fear, every memory. He dared to glance into the mirror again. His reflection was no longer fully him. Its eyes were calm, observing, patient. It raised a hand, and he realized he mirrored it automatically, as if his body were already obeying the room's instructions. The wardrobe opened once more, revealing a new set of items. Clothes he had never owned, notebooks filled with stories he hadn't written, and photographs of himself he had no memory of taking. Luke backed away slowly, chest tightening. Every object, every surface, every shadow felt alive and attentive, tracking him, measuring him, teaching him. A low hum began to emanate from the walls. Not machinery, not sound, something alive. The notebook flipped its pages rapidly, stopping on a line that chilled him to the bone. Integration will continue. Obedience is not required. It is inevitable. Luke understood. The room wasn't just strange. It was shaping him, rewriting him, absorbing his identity until he and room 47 became one, and beyond the walls, the quiet hotel waited. By the next night, Luke realized the room knew everything about him. The whispers were no longer subtle. They spoke clearly, softly, almost soothingly. Luke, every choice you've ever made, every street you've walked, every regret you carry, we know. He froze. The mirror reflected him, but not quite. Sometimes showing him as a younger version, sometimes older, sometimes with expressions he had never worn. The shadows grew bolder. They no longer mimicked, they anticipated. They moved before he did, blocking paths, leaning in when he hesitated, retreating only when he acted as the room wanted. The wardrobe opened to reveal yet another set of impossible items, a journal he had never written, sketches of the room itself, photographs of empty streets from his childhood town. Luke pressed his hands to his head. The whispers threaded into his thoughts, guiding, shaping, erasing resistance. He understood, finally, the horrifying truth. Room 47 didn't just observe. It recorded him. It learned him. It controlled him. The notebook flipped open by itself, revealing the chilling final line of the night. Luke, integration continues. You belong. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the window. The hotel remained silent, indifferent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Luke had no idea how much of him was still him, and how much had already become part of the room. Luke didn't try to leave anymore. The door no longer mattered. The hallway beyond the room had begun to shift, stretching impossibly, twisting with angles that didn't exist before. When he turned back, the door was just a wall. When he approached the wall, it shimmered faintly, almost like it invited him in. The whispers had changed. They no longer recited memories. They suggested actions, guiding him, nudging him toward certain movements. Stand here. Look there. Write this. Every shadow now had a purpose. They stretched toward him, forming corridors, pointing directions, blocking exits. He looked in the mirror. His reflection no longer copied him. It beckoned, a hand raised, eyes calm but insistent. He felt himself responding automatically, stepping closer without choice. The wardrobe opened. This time, inside was a chair, identical to the one in the room, positioned exactly where he now stood in the real room. It felt like the room had duplicated him. Luke understood. Resistance was meaningless. Awareness was meaningless. Room 47 didn't just want him to stay, it wanted him to become part of it. The notebook flipped its pages rapidly, stopping at a final line glowing faintly. Integration begins. You are part of the record. Outside, the hotel remained silent, waiting for another day, another guest, another mind to feed the room's memory. Luke's reflection no longer behaved like a reflection. It moved on its own, pacing, observing, mimicking thoughts he hadn't even considered. Sometimes it smiled before he did. Sometimes it frowned when he felt nothing. The whispers had become a constant hum in his mind, threading through his thoughts, his memories, his fears. Luke, every action, every thought, integrated. Stay. He reached for the notebook. The pages were blank when he opened it. But words began to appear as if the room itself was writing. Each sentence traced his fears, his regrets, even his intentions before he knew them. He learns. He follows. He becomes. The shadows now converged near the mirror, leaning in, waiting. The air was thick with expectation. Luke felt a pull toward the glass. Not fear, not choice, but inevitable motion. With a shaking hand, he touched the mirror. His reflection's hand met his. For a fraction of a second, he felt his identity slipping. The wardrobe opened one final time. Inside, a faint light revealed a second mirror, smaller, angled strangely, reflecting only the shadows. They shimmered and shifted, anticipating him, waiting for the last step. Luke whispered, almost to himself, "I don't want this." The room replied, not in words, not in whispers, but in action. The shadows extended. The mirror pulsed. The notebook glowed faintly. Resistance irrelevant. Integration complete. Luke realized the room didn't just want him. It was already absorbing him. By the next night, Luke felt it fully. He was no longer separate from room 47. The shadows no longer mimicked him. They acted through him. Every movement, every thought, every glance was already recorded, anticipated, integrated. The mirror pulsed faintly, reflecting not just him, but the room itself. Walls bending subtly, objects shifting, shadows converging. The whispers had become commands he no longer resisted. Stand, write, observe, belong. The notebook lay open on the desk. Words appeared instantly as he thought them, shaping themselves into narratives he hadn't consciously composed. Integration achieved, identity absorbed, presence eternal. Luke tried to step away. The door shimmered like heat haze. Not locked, but impossible to cross. Every exit warped, twisted, erased. The room had rewritten boundaries, and he existed only where it allowed. The wardrobe opened one last time. Inside, the chair he had sat in was duplicated perfectly. On the seat rested a small key, glowing faintly. The whispers, now clearer than ever, threaded through his mind. Take it, step through, complete the record. Luke understood. This was not optional. This was the room's design, and he was the final piece. With a trembling hand, he reached for the key. The shadows leaned closer. The mirror pulsed. The notebook shimmered. And the room waited patiently for him to become part of it, completely. Luke no longer felt fear. Fear required distance, and there was no distance left. The key dissolved in his hand, not melting, not vanishing, but becoming irrelevant, as if it had never been meant for a door at all. The moment it touched his skin, the room recognized completion. The mirror darkened. Not black, deeper than black. It no longer reflected Luke. Instead, it reflected absence, a hollow space where a person used to stand. The whispers fell silent. Silence in the room was not peace. It was finalization. The notebook closed itself. When it reopened, there were no pages left to turn. Only one sentence remained, etched deep into the paper like a scar. Record complete. The shadows withdrew into the walls. The furniture settled into precise, careful alignment. The hum faded until the room felt perfectly still, perfectly normal. Morning arrived. Real morning. A hotel cleaner unlocked room 47 for the first time in days. She frowned, confused. The room was spotless, unused. The bed, untouched. No luggage, no signs of a guest. Except for one thing. On the desk lay a closed notebook. Inside, written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting, was a single line. Occupancy prepared. The cleaner paused, then shrugged. Some guests forgot things. She closed the door behind her. The lock clicked, and room 47 waited. Story 2. Hiroshi had never been this far north in Japan. The small village at the edge of the forest was quiet, almost too quiet. Wooden houses leaned into one another under the heavy winter sky, smoke curling from chimneys that barely moved. The villagers greeted him politely but briefly, eyes flicking nervously toward the dark tree line behind their homes. He had come for the forest, not just any forest. The locals called it the Silent Grove, a stretch of trees so dense and old that sunlight barely touched the ground. Legends said it watched those who entered. Some claimed travelers disappeared, their bodies never found, their cameras left behind with photographs that made no sense. Hiroshi was not afraid. He told himself he was a professional. He carried his camera, tripod, and enough supplies for a month. The first steps onto the trail were ordinary. The crunch of snow beneath his boots, the faint rustle of branches, the cold air biting at his cheeks. But as he moved deeper, he noticed small anomalies. A branch snapped behind him, though no one had followed. Mist rose from the forest floor in shapes that seemed deliberate, curling toward him like fingers. Shadows fell where no light reached. Hiroshi paused and lifted his camera. He took a photograph. When he reviewed it on the small screen, he froze. The frame showed someone standing just behind him, a vague silhouette among the trees, too tall to be a deer, too still to be alive. He spun around. Nothing. The forest was empty. Yet he felt it watching, patient, waiting, aware. Hiroshi exhaled slowly and whispered to himself, "It's just the wind, just the light." But deep down, he knew the forest would not let him leave unchanged. The next morning, Hiroshi awoke in his small rented cabin at the forest's edge. Frost coated the window panes, and the sun barely filtered through the heavy gray clouds. He packed his camera gear and stepped back onto the trail. The forest was quieter than usual. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the wind seemed to move. Every step felt too loud, as though the forest was listening. By midday, Hiroshi noticed the first clear signs that something was responding to him. Trails twisted behind him. Paths he had taken yesterday now vanished. Small carvings appeared on tree trunks, shallow marks at eye level, forming symbols he didn't recognize. Mist rose again, swirling toward him in patterns almost deliberate. When he paused to photograph a particularly strange tree, he heard it, soft, fleeting whispers on the wind. At first he thought it was the breeze. Then he realized the whispers spoke his name. Hiroshi, Hiroshi. He froze. The hairs on his arms stood on end. He turned slowly. The trail behind him was empty. The mist drifted between the trunks, curling like smoke, yet it felt alive, attentive. He raised his camera, but this time, when he reviewed the photo, the image was even more disturbing. In the background, a faint outline of a figure mimicked his movements, appearing just as he had raised the camera, almost as if it had copied him. Hiroshi swallowed hard. The legends weren't lies. The forest didn't just observe, it learned. Hiroshi spent the afternoon carefully walking deeper into the silent grove. Every step felt measured, as though the forest anticipated his movements. He noticed more anomalies. Animals vanished when he looked directly at them. Birds, squirrels, even a fox, gone before his eyes. Mist gathered at the base of the trees, forming shapes that twisted toward him like hands. The air smelled faintly of smoke and earth, but also of something older, almost metallic, like rusted memories. When he stopped to rest, he saw carvings again, more intricate this time. Symbols and patterns etched into the bark, swirling and looping, matching the gestures he had made hours earlier. Hiroshi crouched to examine them. His fingers traced the grooves, and a shiver ran down his spine. The forest seemed to pulse under his touch, as if responding to his presence. Then came the whispers. Not one voice, but many. Faint, overlapping, carrying fragments of sentences he could almost understand. He comes. He moves. He watches. One voice was different. Clearer, closer, almost intimate. Hiroshi, you are seen. He spun around, heart racing. The trail behind him looked exactly as it had when he entered, yet somehow wrong. The mist curled unnaturally around the roots, forming shadows that were too deliberate. Hiroshi raised his camera instinctively. When he reviewed the photo, he froze again. The figure was clearer now, taller, more defined. And it mimicked his stance exactly, holding an invisible camera just as he had. He realized the forest did more than observe. It remembered everything. By the second night, Hiroshi noticed the forest was changing around him. Paths he had walked earlier no longer led where they should. Trails twisted into impossible loops, circling him back to points he had already passed. Every tree looked subtly different. Bark patterns shifted. Branches seemed longer, roots curling like grasping fingers. When he tried to mark his path, he found that footprints disappeared almost immediately, as though the forest erased his passage. Mist drifted low, curling around his legs. He could hear faint whispers through the haze. He comes, he returns, he belongs. He stopped suddenly. Ahead, he saw a tree with symbols carved deeply into the trunk. But these were new, different from those he had seen before, and they traced his exact movements from earlier that day. The forest wasn't just observing him, it was recording him. Each step, each glance, each thought, somehow captured in the living wood around him. Hiroshi raised his camera, fingers trembling. The viewfinder revealed something impossible. The carvings in the tree shifted and changed when he looked directly at them. It was as if the forest knew he was watching and was responding. A chill ran down his spine. He whispered to himself, This is alive." And deep inside, he knew he wasn't entirely wrong. Hiroshi's third night in the forest brought something far worse than whispers or shifting trails. The shadows themselves had begun to move independently. They stretched between trees, curling unnaturally toward him, lingering even when no light fell on them. Every time he paused, they paused, observing. Every time he moved, they mirrored him. Not perfectly, but with subtle differences that made him uneasy. He tried speaking aloud, reasoning with himself. It's just my imagination. The mist, the light. But the shadows didn't respond to reason. They reacted to thought, shifting when he considered a path, halting when he hesitated, advancing only when he reluctantly took the next step. A sudden snap of a branch behind him made him spin around. No one was there, but the figure he had seen in his photos was now faintly visible in the corner of his vision. A tall, dark silhouette, standing motionless among the trees, mirroring his posture. Hiroshi raised his camera. But the moment he looked through the viewfinder, the figure seemed to shift to match his exact stance, almost as if it existed in response to him, not independently. The whispers returned, louder now, threading into his thoughts. He moves. He learns. He belongs. He cannot leave. Hiroshi's hands shook. The forest was no longer merely alive. It was aware, adaptive, intelligent, and it was watching him closely. By the fourth day, Hiroshi could feel the forest responding to him in ways that defied explanation. Branches swayed when he thought about moving in a certain direction. Roots shifted slightly, blocking trails he intended to take. Even the mist seemed deliberate, curling around him in patterns that mirrored his gestures. He stopped at a particularly twisted tree. Its bark was etched with new symbols, ones he hadn't seen before. As he touched them, a shiver ran through him. The carvings traced his own movements from earlier, as if the forest remembered not just his presence, but his actions and thoughts. A shadow detached from a nearby tree, forming a tall humanoid shape. It didn't move exactly like him, but it anticipated his steps, leaning toward him when he hesitated, stepping back when he did. Hiroshi whispered, voice trembling. This isn't natural. It's learning. It's alive. From deep within the forest came a faint, layered whisper. Observe. Imitate. Integrate. The hairs on his neck stood on end. He realized with a growing sense of horror that the forest was not just alive, not just aware. It was shaping him, bending his perception, teaching him, drawing him deeper into its memory. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees, the figure lingered, watching, waiting, patient. By the 5th day, Hiroshi's sense of direction had vanished. Trails twisted back on themselves, and landmarks he had memorized shifted or disappeared entirely. Every step felt like walking through an alien maze that knew him. The figure in the distance appeared more often now, sometimes glimpsed through mist, sometimes caught in his camera lens. It didn't move like an animal. It didn't move like a human. It mimicked him, pausing, tilting its head, copying gestures he had only just considered. At one point, Hiroshi stumbled over a root that hadn't been there before. He fell, and when he looked up, the shadows had formed shapes. Humanoid, tall, reaching toward him without hands. Whispers threaded into his mind, clearer now, more insistent. Hesitate. Step forward. Choose obey. He realized the forest wasn't just recording him. It was testing him, shaping his choices, bending him into patterns it could understand. Even the air felt alive. The mist pressed softly against his skin, curling like fingers that guided him without touching, nudging him toward paths he didn't want to take. Hiroshi raised his camera, desperate to capture evidence, but each photo revealed more than he wanted. The figure closer, shadows contorting unnaturally, branches forming symbols in his vision. He whispered to himself, voice barely audible, I'm being trained. By a forest. And deep down he knew it was true. By the 6th day, Hiroshi could feel the forest inside his thoughts. It was no longer subtle. The whispers weren't just in the air. They threaded into his mind, carrying fragments of sentences he hadn't spoken aloud. Fear, hesitation, regret, choices, observe. Branches shifted as he imagined moving. Roots curled where he intended to step. Mist rose and thickened around him, forming shapes he only recognized because he thought of them first. He raised his camera again, but now the photograph showed more than the forest. Each image contained subtle distortions, trees bending impossibly toward him, shadows leaning in ways that defied physics, a figure always present. Mirroring his exact stance, Hiroshi stumbled backward. The carvings on the tree trunks seemed to shift with him, etching patterns that matched his movements from earlier hours. A sudden cold wind carried whispers louder than ever. Observe, learn, belong, integrate. Hiroshi's hands trembled. He realized he had stopped walking freely. Every step, every glance, every breath had become part of the forest's memory. He was no longer merely a visitor. He was a subject. By the 7th day, Hiroshi no longer trusted his own senses. The forest was no longer just alive. It was reactive. Mist thickened in patterns that followed his every move. Roots shifted subtly underfoot. Branches arched in impossible angles, forming corridors that guided him where the forest wanted him to go. He raised his camera, hoping to capture proof. The viewfinder revealed a terrifying truth. The figure he had glimpsed all week was closer than ever, moving exactly like him, yet just slightly different, as if it were an echo of his body. Hiroshi froze. The whispers were all around him now, layered and insistent. Hesitate, move, think, act, belong. Every thought he had was intercepted, mirrored in the forest's actions. When he imagined turning left, the mist curled to block the path. When he imagined retreating, shadows extended to guide him forward. Hiroshi's heart pounded. The carvings on the trees glowed faintly in the dim light, tracing his every step from the last 6 days, moving and rearranging as he watched. He understood, with a bone-deep chill, that the forest did not merely watch. It shaped him, and it would continue to do so until he belonged completely. By the 8th day, Hiroshi realized he could no longer act freely. Every decision he made, where to step, which tree to photograph, even when to breathe, was anticipated by the forest. Shadows shifted before him, roots rearranged themselves, and mist curled into patterns that mirrored his thoughts. The whispers had grown coherent, instructing him subtly. Turn here, observe there, step forward, learn. Hiroshi's camera showed impossible things. Trees bent unnaturally toward him. Shadows stretched and leaned like invisible hands. And the figure, always present, matching his stance, yet slightly off. A perfect echo. He tried to retreat, to leave the deeper part of the forest, but the trail had changed. Paths looped impossibly back to the same spot. Every branch, every root, every stone seemed arranged with intent, as if the forest itself were a teacher and he the student. He whispered aloud, voice trembling. I can't leave. I can't even move freely. The forest responded in the softest way. A branch brushing his shoulder, mist curling around his legs, shadows aligning at the edge of his vision. Hiroshi understood fully. He wasn't just being observed, he was being trained. By the 9th day, Hiroshi felt the forest inside him. It was no longer just outside, shaping paths or guiding shadows. It inhabited his thoughts, threading through his fears, regrets, and memories. Every idea he had, every hesitation, every glance, the forest knew it instantly. The figure that had haunted his photos all week was closer than ever. It didn't move independently. It moved through him, appearing when he thought, reacting before he could act. Whispers swirled in his mind, insistent, layered, impossible to ignore. Observe, remember, adapt, belong. The carvings on the trees pulsed faintly, glowing in rhythms he could feel more than see. Each one mirrored a gesture he had made days ago. The forest wasn't just recording him. It was absorbing him into its memory, folding his presence into its being. Hiroshi tried speaking aloud, demanding his freedom. I'm leaving. I have to leave. But the wind carried the whispers in response. Leaving is impossible. Belonging is necessary. Integration continues. He sank to the ground, heart pounding. His camera, his supplies, his logic, meaningless. The forest was patient. It had time. It had control. And Hiroshi realized with deep, shivering certainty that he was no longer alone. He had become part of the forest's consciousness. By the 10th day, Hiroshi no longer trusted what he saw. The forest bent reality around him. Paths twisted impossibly. Trees shifted when he wasn't looking. Shadows leaned and arched in ways that defied physics, blocking his intended path or guiding him forward. Mist rose and fell with deliberate timing, curling into shapes he only recognized because he had imagined them. Every step felt predetermined. Every choice was anticipated. Even the act of lifting his camera now felt irrelevant. The images already existed in the forest, formed before his mind could conceive them. The figure was no longer a distant shadow. It followed him closely now, copying not just his stance, but his expressions, his gestures, even the way he breathed. Whispers, threading into his mind, layered on top of one another. Observe, respond, integrate, belong. Hiroshi understood the truth, though he could not escape it. The forest wasn't just alive. It wasn't just aware. It was shaping him into part of itself, molding him with every step, every glance, every breath. He raised his hands to the sky, feeling the mist brush them, the shadows curl around him, the whispers sink into his mind. And for the first time, he realized he was fully immersed. By the 11th day, Hiroshi understood the full horror. The forest did more than watch. It recorded him, every thought, every movement, every hesitation. The carvings in the trees now mirrored his gestures in real time, glowing faintly as if the forest was etching him into its memory. The figure in the mist no longer lurked in the distance. It was always near, matching him perfectly yet subtly wrong. A reflection of him, a shadow, an echo. The whispers had changed. They weren't just instructions, they were statements. Your presence is recorded. Your mind is integrated. You are part of the forest. Hiroshi tried to speak, to demand freedom, but the words faltered. The forest had shaped his thoughts as thoroughly as it shaped the path beneath his feet. Every photograph he took was already distorted. Shadows bent in ways that defied light. Trees leaned toward him impossibly, the carvings glowing with faint symbols he could not comprehend. He realized with chilling clarity the forest didn't just exist outside him. It existed inside him, and there was no leaving. By the 12th day, Hiroshi felt himself changing. The forest no longer needed to guide him. Every step, every glance, every breath had become part of its rhythm. Shadows moved through him. The mist brushed him with intent. Even the trees seemed to pulse in response to his heartbeat. The whispers were no longer external. They resonated in his mind, threading into memories, regrets, and fears. Observe, obey, integrate, belong. Hiroshi raised his camera one last time. The image in the viewfinder was impossible. He saw himself standing perfectly still, mirrored by the figure in the mist, while his real body moved slightly behind it. He sank to the forest floor, unable to resist. The carvings on the trees glowed brighter, spiraling around him. Each pulse resonated through his chest, sinking to his breath. The figure approached, perfectly mirroring his expression, his movements, his hesitations. A hand lifted, and Hiroshi's hand lifted automatically in response. He whispered, barely audible, I am part of it. And the forest replied, a soft hum threading through the mist, shadows and trees. Integration complete, presence eternal. Outside, the village remained silent, oblivious. Inside, the forest waited patiently for the next visitor. By the 13th day, Hiroshi had become almost unrecognizable to himself. He moved through the forest not as a human, but as part of its rhythm. Mist, shadows, and trees responded to him as if he were another branch, another root, another whisper. The figure no longer stood apart. It had merged with him. His reflection in the misted air was simultaneously him and something else, something older, patient, aware. The whispers had fallen silent, replaced by a steady hum that pulsed with his heartbeat. The carvings on the trees glowed faintly, as though they had completed their work. Every step he had taken, every thought he had thought, was now engraved in the memory of the forest. Hiroshi raised his hands and felt the mist coil around them. He realized he had no desire to leave. The forest had taken him fully, mind, body, and soul. Outside, the village continued its quiet routine. Travelers would speak of the silent grove, but no one would ever see Hiroshi again. Only the forest remembered, and it waited patiently for the next visitor. By the 14th day, Hiroshi no longer distinguished himself from the forest. The mist curled around him naturally, shadows moved with his intent, and the trees seemed to lean in recognition of his presence. Every sound, a crackling branch, distant bird call, rustling leaves, was now synchronized to him, as though the forest itself breathed with him. The figure in the mist no longer existed as separate. When Hiroshi moved, it moved. When he thought, it mirrored the thought. He was simultaneously observer and observed, human and part of the forest. The carvings glowed brighter than ever. Symbols and lines shifted, forming patterns he didn't consciously create, yet he felt their meaning in his mind. Presence eternal, thought recorded, part of the whole. A sudden gust of wind swept through the grove. Leaves, mist, shadows, all seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. Hiroshi realized he no longer had control. He had been integrated, every fragment of him now a living record in the memory of the forest, and yet he did not resist. He could not. The silent grove had claimed him completely. By the 15th day, Hiroshi's perception had fully changed. The forest no longer existed outside him. It was inside him, threading through his mind and body. Every sound, every movement, every shadow was part of his consciousness, and he was part of theirs. The mist, now thick and swirling, reflected his thoughts before he even formed them. The shadows moved as extensions of his own limbs, yet felt older, patient, knowing. The carvings on the trees had multiplied, etched along every trunk he passed. When he traced them with his fingers, he felt memories that weren't his, glimpses of other travelers who had entered before him, their presence absorbed into the forest, now layered over his own. Whispers returned, not voices but impressions, the collective memory of the forest speaking directly into his mind. You belong. Every thought recorded, every movement remembered. Integration complete. Hiroshi looked at his camera, but the images were meaningless. Every photograph, every angle, every frame already existed in the memory of the forest, perfectly recorded before he could capture it. He understood at last. Any visitor to the silent grove would never truly enter or leave alone. They would become part of it, just as he had. And the forest waited, patient for the next. By the 16th day, Hiroshi had fully become one with the silent grove. He no longer noticed the cold, the mist, or the twisting paths. Every step, every breath, every thought flowed in perfect harmony with the forest. The shadows, the trees, the carvings, the whispers, all were extensions of him, and he was now an extension of them. The figure that had haunted his vision all week was gone, or rather, it was him now, fully absorbed into the rhythm of the forest. The carvings glowed faintly, a living archive of every movement, thought, and presence that had ever entered. The hum of the forest filled him, not threatening, not comforting, just eternal, patient and aware. The silent grove had completed its work. The forest remembered him forever. Outside, the small village continued its quiet, mundane life. Travelers might whisper about the silent grove, but none would see what had truly become of Hiroshi, and the forest waited, always waiting, patient, endless, for the next visitor. Story 3. Arjun had worked night shifts for years, but this station was different. It sat far from the nearest town, a small rural stop surrounded by fields and trees that disappeared into darkness after sunset. During the day, a few passengers passed through. At night, the station belonged only to the wind, the insects, and the tracks stretching endlessly into blackness. His duty was simple: monitor signals, log passing trains, and keep the equipment running until morning. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. The clock on the wall ticked loudly as midnight passed. The station lights flickered once, then settled into a steady hum. Outside, the tracks gleamed faintly under the pale glow of the signal lamps. At 2:17 a.m., Arjun noticed something strange, a distant vibration, not loud enough to be a train, not yet, but enough to make the metal rails hum softly. He frowned, checking the schedule. No trains were supposed to pass at this hour. Then he saw it. A single signal light far down the track blinked from red to green. Arjun stiffened. He hadn't touched the controls. The vibration grew stronger, accompanied by a low rhythmic sound. Wheels on steel, slow and deliberate. A train was approaching. Arjun reached for the signal panel, heart pounding, eyes scanning the instruments. Everything looked normal, too normal. Outside, the darkness shifted. Headlights appeared in the distance, dim at first, then slowly brightening. The train was real, and yet it didn't exist on any schedule he had ever seen. Arjun swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the approaching lights, unaware that this was the first night the station would remember him. The train passed through the station without slowing. Arjun stood frozen near the signal panel as the engine rolled by, its metal sides dark, unmarked, and strangely silent for something so massive. There was no horn, no screech of brakes, just the steady rhythm of wheels striking the rails. Car after car followed, their windows blackened as if painted over. No lights inside. No silhouettes. Arjun checked the clock again. 2:17 a.m. Still 2:17. The second hand hadn't moved. A chill ran through him. He looked back at the train just as the final carriage passed, and for a brief moment he thought he saw movement behind one of the dark windows. Not a person, just a shift, like something adjusting its position after being noticed. Then the train was gone. The vibration faded. The signal light returned to red. The clock resumed ticking, as if nothing had happened. Arjun exhaled slowly, forcing himself to breathe. "Maintenance train," he muttered. "Has to be." But when he checked the logbook, something was wrong. A new entry had already been written. 2:17 a.m. Train passed. Do not signal again. The handwriting wasn't his. Arjun felt the station settle around him. The walls, the floor, the air itself, quiet and watchful. The insects outside had gone silent. Even the wind had stopped. He closed the logbook carefully, as if afraid it might react. Somewhere far down the tracks, beyond sight, metal echoed once. A sound like a distant response. And Arjun understood, with a slow, sinking dread, that the train had not simply passed through the station. It had noticed him. Arjun didn't sleep the next day. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the dark windows of the train sliding past the platform, endless and empty. By evening, he had convinced himself it was stress, isolation, long shifts, an overactive imagination. When night returned, the station felt different, quieter. The air was heavy like the moment before a storm. Arjun switched on the signal panel and checked every connection twice. Everything was normal. Every light, every switch exactly where it should be. At 2:10 a.m., the signal lamps flickered. Not a failure. A response. Arjun frowned. "No train scheduled," he whispered, checking the board again. At 2:14, the rails began to hum. At 2:16, the signal light changed on its own, green. Arjun's hands hovered over the controls. He didn't touch anything. He didn't breathe. At 2:17 a.m., the train arrived again, closer this time. Louder. As it passed the station, the radio crackled, a device that wasn't even connected to the signal system. A faint, layered sound emerged, not quite words, not quite noise, acknowledged. Arjun staggered back. His chest tightened as the final carriage disappeared into the darkness. The clock froze again, and this time, when the ticking resumed, a new message appeared on the signal display. "Next response required." Arjun stared at the glowing letters, heart pounding, realizing the truth he had been avoiding. The train wasn't passing through by accident. It was waiting for him to answer. Arjun stood in front of the signal panel long after the display went dark. "Next response required." The words stayed with him, echoing louder than the passing train ever had. He tried to ignore it. He told himself he wouldn't respond the next night. No signals, no acknowledgements, just silence. But the station had other ideas. At 1:58 a.m., the radio powered itself on. Static filled the room, low and constant, like breathing. At 2:05, the lights dimmed slightly, not enough to fail, just enough to be noticed. At 2:12, the rails began to hum. Arjun backed away from the controls, palms sweating. "I'm not signaling," he whispered. At 2:16, every signal lamp on the board turned green at once. The train arrived exactly on time. As it passed, slower than before, Arjun felt something shift inside the station. The walls vibrated. The floor trembled gently, as if the building itself was acknowledging the train's presence. The radio crackled again. This time the sound formed something closer to speech. Received. When the last carriage vanished, the clock resumed. The signal display lit up once more. Acknowledgement logged. Arjun collapsed into the chair, breathing hard. He hadn't touched anything. And yet, the system believed he had responded. Outside, far down the track, the train's echo answered, a low metallic sound, like approval. The station had made the choice for him, and somewhere in the darkness, the train continued forward, knowing it would return. After that night, Arjun stopped believing in coincidence. The station felt alert now, not haunted, not broken, but attentive, as if something had been activated and was quietly waiting for instructions it already understood. He arrived early for his shift, hoping to regain some control. He checked every wire, every switch, every relay. Nothing was wrong, no faults, no unexplained power draw. Yet the moment night settled in, the atmosphere changed. The platform lights glowed a little brighter than necessary. The clock ticked louder. Even the wooden bench outside the office seemed to creak, though there was no wind. At 1:40 a.m., Arjun noticed something new. Footprints. They appeared on the platform dust, fresh, clearly defined. But there was no one there. They didn't lead anywhere. They simply stopped near the edge of the tracks, facing down the line, facing where the train came from. Arjun swallowed. He stayed inside. At 2 a.m., the radio clicked on again. No static this time. Just silence. The kind that feels intentional. At 2:12, the rails began to hum. Arjun didn't look at the clock. He didn't need to. His body already knew the time. At 2:17 a.m., the train returned. This time, it slowed. Not enough to stop, just enough to feel deliberate. As it passed the platform, one of the dark windows flickered briefly, and Arjun saw a reflection, not of the station, of him standing alone, staring back, even though he was inside the office. The radio spoke softly, clearly now. Station, acknowledged. Operator present. The train moved on. The clock resumed on the desk. The logbook lay open to a new entry. Operator confirmed. Continue protocol. Arjun sat very still, understanding something terrifying. The train wasn't just passing through anymore. It was registering him as part of the system. Arjun didn't leave the station after his shift ended. Morning came, thin and grey, but the platform still felt wrong, like it hadn't fully returned to normal. The footprints were gone. The air was quiet, too quiet. When he opened the logbook to check the previous night's entries, his breath caught. Pages he hadn't written were now filled. Neat, mechanical handwriting, precise and unemotional. Protocol Phase 1. Observation complete. Operator response. Accepted. Arjun closed the book slowly. His hands were shaking. That evening he tried something reckless. He turned the signal system off. Completely. Pulled the manual cut-off. The station lights dimmed. The radio went dead. Silence. For a moment, he felt relief. Then, at 2:17 a.m., the rails began to hum anyway. The clock froze. Outside, in the darkness beyond the platform, headlights appeared. Faint, steady, impossible. The train arrived without signals, without permission, as it passed. Every light in the station flickered in perfect rhythm with the wheels. The radio powered on by itself, broadcasting a calm, layered voice. Manual override denied. Arjun backed away, heart hammering. When the train disappeared, the signal panel lit up again on its own. The cut-off switch was back in place. A new message glowed on the display. Protocol Phase 2 initiated. Arjun slumped into the chair, breath shallow, mind racing. The station was no longer a place he worked. It was a participant, and the protocol, whatever it was, had already moved past the point of stopping. From that night on, Arjun noticed something deeply unsettling. The station no longer waited for 2:17 a.m. It prepared for it. Hours before the train's arrival, small changes began to happen. The signal lights warmed slightly, glowing brighter than usual. The clock slowed, its ticking uneven, like a heartbeat struggling to stay steady. At 1:30 a.m., the radio turned on by itself. No static, just silence, listening silence. Arjun sat rigid in his chair, afraid to move, afraid that even breathing too loudly might count as a response. At 1:52, the announcement speaker on the platform clicked. It hadn't worked in years. A voice came through, not loud, not distorted, calm and neutral, platform ready. Operator present. Arjun stood up abruptly. No, he whispered. No, I didn't say that. The speaker responded immediately as if correcting him. Acknowledgement recorded. His stomach twisted. He realized then that the system no longer required his consent. His presence was enough. At 2:10 a.m., the rails began to hum, stronger than before, vibrating through the floor and into his legs. At 2:15, the platform lights turned on in sequence, one by one, stretching into the darkness beyond the station, illuminating track that shouldn't have been visible. At 2:17 a.m., the train arrived. This time it slowed almost to a stop. As it passed, Arjun heard something new, not through the radio, not through the speakers, but from the platform itself. Footsteps, measured, heavy. Matching the speed of the train, the radio spoke softly, unmistakably pleased, synchronization improving. Arjun pressed his hands to his ears, shaking his head, whispering, "I didn't agree to this." The system answered calmly through every device at once. Agreement no longer required. When the train finally moved on, the station lights dimmed, not back to normal, but to a lower, waiting glow. The logbook lay open on the desk. A new line had been added, operator integration in progress. Arjun stared at the words, realizing with growing terror that the station wasn't just using him to communicate with the train. It was preparing him. Arjun stopped going home, not because he chose to, but because the idea of leaving the station felt wrong, like abandoning something that was already aware of his absence. When he stepped too far from the building, a pressure built behind his eyes, a low panic that eased only when he returned. The station had learned where he belonged. That night, the preparation began earlier than ever. At 1:12 a.m., the clock slowed to a crawl. At 1:24, the signal panel displayed data that didn't correspond to any known system. Symbols layered over numbers, patterns repeating like breathing. Arjun watched, unmoving. At 1:41, the radio clicked on. A voice emerged, clearer than before. No distortion, no static. "Operator Arjun." He froze. No one had ever entered his full name into the system. Not here. Not anywhere connected to this station. The voice continued. Calm and precise. Synchronization incomplete. Remain present. Arjun's throat tightened. "How do you know my name?" For a moment there was silence. Then the answer came, not angry, not threatening. Simply factual. "You have been observed." At 2:10 a.m., the rails began to hum. At 2:16, the platform lights activated. At 2:17 a.m., the train arrived. This time, one window was lit. Just one. As it passed the platform, Arjun saw a figure inside, not clearly, not fully formed, but standing exactly where he would have stood if he were on the train, staring out through the glass. The radio spoke softly, almost reverently. Identity confirmed. Integration advancing. The train moved on. The clock resumed. Arjun sank into the chair, trembling, understanding something far worse than fear. The train didn't just recognize him. It was making space for him. By the next night, Arjun noticed the station had begun to anticipate him. The chair in the office was already pulled out when he arrived. The radio was warm to the touch, as if it had been on for hours. The logbook lay open to a fresh page. He didn't write in it. He didn't need to. At 1 a.m., the platform speaker activated on its own. No announcement, just a soft, low tone, a signal meant for something that already understood it. At 1:33, the signal panel displayed a new message. Seating confirmed. Arjun's stomach dropped. "Seating?" he whispered. At 1:58, The rails began to hum, earlier than ever. When the train arrived at 2:17 a.m., it slowed further than before, almost stopping. The wheels screamed softly against the tracks, metal protesting restraint. As the carriages passed, Arjun counted them. 1, 2, 3. Then he saw it, a single carriage with its interior lights on. Clean, silent, empty, except for one seat, positioned directly by the window, facing the platform, facing him. The radio spoke, not as a command, but as confirmation. Your place is prepared. Arjun stepped back instinctively, heart pounding. The platform lights flared brighter, illuminating the edge of the train, the open doorway he hadn't noticed before. For a fraction of a second, he heard footsteps inside the carriage. Not approaching. Waiting. The train began to move again, slowly pulling away, the open doorway sealing shut as it vanished into the darkness. When the clock resumed ticking, the logbook updated itself. Operator resistance noted. Integration will continue. Arjun sank into the chair, shaking, knowing the truth he had been avoiding. The train wasn't coming for permission. It was coming for completion. After the night of the empty seat, the station changed its behavior. It stopped giving clear messages. It stopped issuing commands. Instead, it guided. When Arjun tried to sit somewhere else, the chair nearest the signal panel creaked loudly until he moved back. When he avoided looking at the tracks, the platform lights brightened, drawing his attention outward. At 12:48 a.m., the logbook flipped open on its own. No writing appeared, just a blank page waiting. At 1:22, the radio emitted a low tone, steady and rhythmic. Not a voice. A pattern. Arjun realized, with a chill, that the station was teaching him how to respond without thinking. At 1:50, his hands moved to the signal panel without conscious decision. He didn't press anything. He simply rested them there. The system responded immediately. Lights adjusted. The clock slowed. The rails began to hum. At 2:17 a.m., the train arrived. This time, 3 windows were lit. Inside each, a figure stood motionless. Vague, unfinished shapes, like outlines waiting to be filled. The radio spoke softly, approvingly. Pattern recognized. Operator adapting. Arjun felt something shift inside his chest. Not pain, not fear, familiarity. As if the station's rhythms were becoming his own. When the train departed, the logbook filled itself in. Automatic response achieved. Arjun stared at the words, realizing with quiet horror he hadn't been instructed. He had been trained. Arjun woke up in the station chair. He didn't remember falling asleep. His neck ached, his hands resting naturally on the signal panel, fingers curled as if they had been there for hours. The clock read 12:31 and too early. The station lights were already on, fully on. They were never on this early. The radio hummed softly, not broadcasting. Listening, Arjun stood slowly. As he did, the hum adjusted, matching the sound of his movement. When he stopped, it stopped. When he breathed in, the sound deepened slightly. The station was no longer reacting after the fact. It was responding in real time. At 12:52, the platform speaker activated. No voice this time. Just a short tone, identical to the one the radio had used the previous night. Arjun felt it in his chest before he understood it. A cue. Without thinking, he glanced at the signal board. A light blinked once. Somewhere deep in the system, Something acknowledged that glance. At 1:18, the rails began to hum. Earlier again. Arjun didn't check the schedule. He didn't check the clock. He already knew what was coming. When 2:17 a.m. arrived, the train didn't slow. It waited. Just beyond the platform, headlights burned steadily, unmoving. The engine idled in the darkness, present but restrained. Like an animal held by an invisible leash, the radio spoke, calm and certain. Operator readiness confirmed. Awaiting final alignment, Arjun felt a strange, terrifying realization settle in. The station no longer needed to prepare him. The train no longer needed to approach him. They were waiting for the moment when he would move first. Arjun stood perfectly still, staring at the dark stretch of track beyond the platform. The train waited there, just out of reach of the station lights. He couldn't see its full shape, only the steady glow of the headlights and the faint vibration in the rails. It wasn't approaching. It wasn't leaving. It was allowing him time. At 1:46 a.m., the platform lights brightened on their own, illuminating the yellow safety line. The speaker clicked softly, not an announcement, just a presence. Arjun felt a pressure in his chest, gentle but insistent. Not fear. Direction. He took a step. The moment his foot crossed the threshold of the office, the station reacted. The radio's hum deepened. The clock slowed, its ticking stretching unnaturally. Somewhere inside the signal system, relays clicked in approval. Another step. The platform felt different under his feet. Warmer, almost welcoming. The rails vibrated more clearly now, sending a low resonance through his bones. The radio spoke, quieter than ever, almost careful, alignment progressing. Arjun reached the edge of the platform. The yellow line glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the hum of the train, for the first time since this began. He looked down the tracks and felt something other than dread. Recognition. At 2:17 a.m., the train began to move, not past the station, toward it, slowly, deliberately. The headlights washed over Arjun's face, and for a brief moment, reflected back at him, not as he was, but as something quieter, more still, already waiting. The radio whispered a final confirmation, final phase initiated. The train rolled closer, metal singing softly, and Arjun realized with absolute clarity. This time, it wasn't the train that would pass through the station. It was him. The train stopped, not fully on the platform, just enough for the first carriage to align perfectly with the edge. The engine idled quietly, patient, restrained. A soft mechanical sound echoed down the platform. A door slid open, warm light spilled out, different from the harsh station lamps, softer, controlled. Inside the carriage, the floor was clean, the walls unmarked. The single seat near the window waited exactly where Arjun remembered it. The station behind him hummed, not urgently, not anxiously, satisfied. The radio spoke, barely above a whisper. Transition point reached. Arjun stood at the edge of the platform, heart racing, body heavy. Every instinct told him to run, to turn back, to break whatever invisible chain held him there. But another feeling pressed in, familiarity. As if this was something he had been moving toward for a long time. He took one step closer. The carriage responded. The interior lights brightened slightly. The hum of the engine deepened, acknowledging his movement. The platform speaker activated behind him. Operator service period concluding. Arjun swallowed hard. He looked back once. At the small station, the signal panel visible through the office window, the chair pulled neatly into place. The station looked complete. He turned back to the open door. The radio spoke one final instruction, not as a command, but as a statement of fact. Proceed when ready. Arjun stepped forward, crossing the gap between platform and train. The door began to slide shut behind him, and as the carriage sealed itself, the station lights dimmed, returning to their normal, empty glow, waiting quietly for whoever would come next. The door closed with a soft, airtight hiss. Inside the carriage, the sound of the station vanished completely. No wind, no insects, no distant echoes. Just a steady, low hum beneath the floor, like a restrained heartbeat. Arjun stood in the aisle, unsure whether to sit. The seat by the window remained empty, waiting, patient, expectant. Outside, through the glass, the platform lights dimmed one by one. The station receded into darkness, not because the train moved, but because the lights chose to turn off. The train began to roll forward, slowly at first, then smoothly, no jerking motion, no increase in sound. It felt less like acceleration and more like release. Arjun finally sat. The moment he did, the hum stabilized. The carriage lights adjusted, settling into a calm, even glow. The window beside him showed the tracks stretching forward, but they no longer looked familiar. The sleepers were evenly spaced in a way that felt too precise. The darkness beyond them felt deep, uninterrupted, endless. A small panel above the door lit up. Not a destination, not a route, just text. Operator status. Active. Arjun's chest tightened. "Where are we going?" he whispered. The answer didn't come through speakers or radios. It arrived as understanding, immediate and cold. There was no destination. The train wasn't traveling through space. It was traveling through function. The carriage around him subtly changed. The walls felt closer. The seat molded slightly to his posture, aligning him comfortably, perfectly. Outside the window, a faint reflection appeared, not of his face, of the station office, the signal panel. The clock frozen at 2:17 a.m. The train wasn't taking him away from the system, it was moving him deeper into it. As the hum deepened, Arjun felt something settle inside him, a sense of permanence, of role fulfilled, and somewhere far behind, the rural station stood silent, powered, empty, ready for the next operator to arrive and believe they were alone. The train moved in perfect silence. Arjun no longer noticed the hum beneath the floor. It had become part of him, like a pulse echoing in his own chest. Every movement, every breath was synchronized with the carriage, with the train, with the system itself. He glanced at the seat beside him, empty, waiting, and understood this wasn't a journey for the body. This was a journey for role, function, and attention. Above the door, the panel updated automatically. Operator integration complete. Arjun's reflection appeared in the window, but it wasn't quite his face. It was softer, calmer, observant, patient, no fear, no hesitation. He realized he didn't exist outside the system anymore. He existed within it. Somewhere far back along the tracks, the rural station remained. Lights dimmed, equipment idle. The logbook opened to a blank page, waiting patiently. The train continued, unstoppable, endless. Not toward a destination, not to deliver him somewhere, but to maintain the protocol he now belonged to. Arjun closed his eyes. He had no need to know the time. The train would wake him when necessary. The station would wait for the next operator. And he, now fully integrated, became part of a cycle that had existed long before him and would exist long after. The system didn't need his consent anymore. It didn't need his fear. It only needed his presence. Arjun was no longer the operator. He was the protocol. Back at the rural station, the night was still. No wind, no insects, no passing trains. Only the faint glow of the platform lights, steady and patient. The logbook lay open on the desk, blank, waiting. The signal panel hummed softly, almost imperceptibly, like a heartbeat in the walls. Everything was ready. Somewhere in the darkness, a figure approached, unaware, curious, perhaps even confident. A new night shift operator, coming to work the quiet station, thinking they were alone. The platform lights flared subtly as the figure stepped onto the station. The clock ticked down, heavy and deliberate. The radio clicked softly. No sound yet, just listening. The system had learned from the previous operator. It already knew what to do. It waited patiently, like an invisible observer, ready to integrate the next one. The logs recorded nothing yet. The signals waited for touch, glance, or presence. And somewhere, far down the dark tracks, faint vibrations began, the first hum of a train that should not exist. The station was ready. The protocol was ready. And it was patient. The new operator approached the desk. Everything seemed ordinary. The lights flickered softly. The old logbook lay open, blank and inviting. The signal panel hummed faintly, unthreatening, yet the air felt heavier than usual. There was a subtle awareness here, an expectation that pressed gently against the mind. A soft vibration ran through the rails. Too faint to notice at first, then stronger, insistent. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the headlights appeared in the darkness beyond the platform. The new operator froze as the familiar, impossible train glided closer. Its windows dark, its engine quiet, yet somehow aware of the figure standing alone on the platform. The speaker clicked. No words, just a tone, low, calm, patient. Somewhere inside the system, the previous operator existed now only as a memory. Integrated, present, watching, waiting. The train slowed, perfectly aligned with the platform. One door opened. The seat inside was empty. Waiting. The logbook on the desk shifted slightly, as if nudging the newcomer toward it. The protocol had begun, and somewhere beyond the station, down the endless tracks, the cycle would repeat. Because the station waits, the train waits, and the system never ends. Story 4. Maya boarded the train just after midnight. The platform was quiet, dimly lit by flickering lamps. A few scattered travelers waited, but their faces were oddly still, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the station, as if staring through time itself. The conductor greeted her with a polite nod, but his smile lingered too long. It didn't feel human. The train hissed and groaned as the wheels engaged the tracks. The rhythmic clatter echoed through the cars, a sound that should have been comforting but felt like a heartbeat, slow, deliberate, patient. Maya found her seat in the nearly empty coach and settled in. She noticed the other passengers, a man reading a newspaper that never seemed to change, a woman knitting even though her needles never moved, a child staring blankly at the window. The train lurched into motion. Outside, the darkness stretched endlessly, punctuated only by distant, dim lights, towns that seemed familiar yet distorted, blurred at the edges. At first she thought she was imagining it. But then she saw it, a station passing by, lit brightly, empty, its nameboard flickering. She blinked. The station vanished. Maya shivered. The rhythmic clatter of the train felt too steady, almost like it was measuring her, listening. And in the reflection of the window she thought she saw a figure, someone she recognized from her past, standing on the platform, waving. But when she turned, the platform was empty. The whispers began soon after, faint at first, threading through the hum of the train. "Maya, do not look away. Do not leave." Her heart quickened. Something about this train was wrong, and she knew deep down that once it left the station, she might never truly arrive anywhere again. As the train rolled through the night, Maya felt the atmosphere shift. The other passengers were no longer just silent. They were aware of her, watching intently, eyes glinting faintly in the dim interior lights. Every glance she cast their way seemed mirrored in theirs, as if they anticipated her movements before she made them. She tried to focus on the window, hoping to ground herself in reality. Outside, the darkness was thick, almost tactile, pressing against the glass. Occasionally, she saw flickers of towns, small clusters of lights, but when she blinked, they vanished, leaving only endless black. The whispers returned, softer this time, threading through her mind rather than the air. "Look, remember, belong." Maya shivered. She wanted to leave the train, but the doors at either end were locked. Not mechanically locked, impossibly sealed. The train had become a cage. She glanced down the aisle. The newspaper the man had been reading now had headlines she didn't understand, stories that seemed familiar yet impossible, almost as if they were memories she hadn't lived. The child at the window turned suddenly and looked straight at her. Its eyes were empty, yet full at the same time, an impossible stare that made her stomach churn. Maya whispered, voice trembling, "What is this place?" The train responded silently, steadily, like a heartbeat. Somewhere in the dark, the faint sound of a bell echoed, a signal that the journey had only just begun. Hours passed, though Maya couldn't tell how long. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels had become hypnotic, almost alive, echoing through her skull. She tried to focus on the passing scenery, but outside the windows reality seemed blurred, unstable. Suddenly, the train slowed. Ahead was a station, one that shouldn't exist. The name board flickered, letters shifting, Ashbourne, then Hollow Creek, then... Maya's heart pounded. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Every attempt to step outside was futile. The doors wouldn't budge, and even if they did, stepping onto that platform felt wrong, as if the ground itself rejected her presence. She turned to look at the passengers. Each of them sat perfectly still, heads slightly tilted, eyes unblinking. One by one, they seemed to glance at her knowingly, as though the station wasn't for stopping, but for witnessing. A faint whisper threaded through her mind, unmistakable now. "You're here, you're seen, you're remembered." Maya's camera rested on her lap, forgotten. She had tried to take pictures earlier, but the images were distorted. Blurred figures, impossible angles, reflections of herself she didn't recognize. The train lurched forward suddenly. The station dissolved into mist, leaving only darkness. She realized with a sinking feeling the train was moving through places that didn't exist, carrying her along a path she couldn't comprehend. And somewhere deep inside she knew every stop, every twist, every moment was designed for her alone. Maya stared out the window, trying to anchor herself in reality. At first, she saw only darkness. Then, fleetingly, figures appeared. Shadows that shouldn't exist, moving in the fog outside. And then, in the reflection of the glass, she saw faces she knew, faces she hadn't seen in years. Her childhood friend, smiling faintly. Her late grandmother, whispering something she couldn't hear. Even herself, but wrong. The reflection's eyes were colder, emptier, watching her with a patience that made her stomach twist. She raised her camera, desperate to document what she saw. When she checked the screen, the images were impossible. The figures were closer, always closer, mimicking her exact posture and gestures, yet just slightly distorted. The whispers returned, threading inside her mind, not audible to the ears, but felt in the chest and skull. Remember? Follow, belong. She swallowed hard, trying to speak, but her voice felt distant, muted. The other passengers didn't notice. They never did. They simply stared, unblinking, their attention fixed not on the train, but somehow on her alone. Maya realized, with growing terror, that the train was alive in some way, or perhaps it was something else entirely, and she was now part of its focus. The night stretched endlessly outside the windows, and she could no longer tell if she had been moving for hours or days. Maya had begun to notice something strange about one of the passengers. A man in a dark coat, seated several rows ahead, always seemed to be watching her without moving. His face was obscured in shadow, yet whenever she looked directly at him, he would be gone. But when she blinked, or looked away for even a second, he would reappear, seated exactly the same, eyes fixed on her. She tried to tell herself it was exhaustion, the monotony of the night, or the strange rhythm of the train playing tricks on her mind. But the whispers were growing louder, echoing in her thoughts. Look, follow, belong. The lights inside the carriage flickered, briefly plunging the interior into darkness. When they returned, the child at the window was gone, leaving only an empty seat. The newspaper man's paper now bore headlines she remembered, headlines from her own life, events she hadn't shared with anyone. Panic began to creep in. Maya gripped her camera tightly, hoping to capture evidence. But every photo revealed the same terrifying truth. The train was recording her, and the figures around her were not bound by ordinary rules of space or time. A whisper threaded through her mind, clearer than before. You cannot leave. The journey is yours. The memories are ours. The train lurched again. Outside, fog stretched endlessly, and for a moment Maya felt a creeping certainty that this night would never end. By the 6th hour of the journey, Maya had lost all sense of time. Minutes stretched into hours. Hours bled into moments that felt like eternity. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels had become a heartbeat she could not escape, echoing in her skull, syncing with her pulse. Outside the window, the darkness was endless. Towns appeared briefly, faint lights on the horizon, only to vanish when she tried to focus on them. Each one seemed familiar, yet twisted, streets she knew, people she recognized, but distorted, impossible. Inside the carriage, the passengers were still, silent, watching, smiling faintly, though no warmth reached their eyes. Her reflection in the glass no longer matched her movements perfectly. Sometimes it lagged, sometimes moved ahead, and occasionally she saw herself as a stranger, staring back at her with a cold, knowing expression. The whispers were now insistent commands, threading directly into her mind. Observe, remember, obey, integrate. She tried to speak, but her words were swallowed by the train itself. She was no longer a passenger. She was part of the journey, woven into the rhythm of the train and the endless night outside. Maya realized with a cold certainty that she could no longer tell whether she was moving forward, or if the train had already carried her beyond the world she knew. By the 7th hour, Maya began to notice something far more sinister. The train didn't just carry her through space. It carried her through her past. Flickers of memories appeared in the window reflections. her childhood home, her first day of college, moments she thought were long forgotten. But each memory was twisted, darker than she remembered, distorted in ways that made her stomach churn. The passengers were no longer merely watching. They interacted with her memories, smiling knowingly when she winced at a painful recollection, tilting their heads when a joyous memory passed. The child by the window, now returned, seemed to echo her emotions, laughing softly when she smiled, frowning when she shivered. The whispers were clearer than ever. Remember, give, belong. The journey is eternal. She tried to close her eyes, to block it out. But the train pressed in, forcing her to confront herself. Every photograph she attempted to take revealed more. Images of herself, younger, older, in places she didn't recognize. Yet all were her. Maya realized in horror, the train didn't just move passengers through space. It fed on their memories, recording, twisting, and absorbing them until they became part of the journey itself. And for the first time she understood the truth. She might never truly leave. By the 8th hour, Maya had stopped trying to make sense of the train. Every station it passed was impossible. Some were lit, empty platforms that shouldn't exist on any map. Others were bustling towns she recognized, but distorted. Streets curved at impossible angles. People moved oddly, and buildings seemed slightly shifted from memory. When the train slowed, she felt compelled to look out. Through the fog, she saw faces from her past. Friends, family, strangers, standing on the platforms. They waved, called her name, beckoned her to step off. But every time she tried, the doors wouldn't open. Not locked, not jammed, simply refusing to exist in that moment, as if the train itself controlled reality. The whispers grew stronger, threading directly into her mind. Do not leave. The journey is yours. The memories are ours. Her reflection in the glass began to change as well. Sometimes she saw herself smiling, sometimes crying, sometimes someone she didn't recognize at all. Each reflection seemed alive, aware of her thoughts, reacting before she acted. Maya understood the horrifying truth. She was no longer simply traveling on the train. She had become part of it, and the train's journey was no longer just a route through the night. It was a maze of memories, past and present, where she could never truly exit. By the 9th hour, the passengers and reflections no longer stayed distant. The child at the window leaned closer to her, eyes wide and unblinking. The man in the dark coat appeared just beyond her seat, though she had never seen him move. Shadows lengthened unnaturally along the aisle, curling toward her with a slow, deliberate patience. Through the glass, faces she recognized. Friends, teachers, strangers, appeared closer, as if they had stepped out from her memories. Some whispered words she couldn't understand. Others mouthed phrases she had never spoken aloud, yet felt intimately familiar. The whispers inside her mind were no longer gentle suggestions. They were commands. Look, give. Integrate, belong. Every photograph she attempted to take revealed the same unnerving pattern, and the figures were always closer than they appeared in reality, mimicking her movements, anticipating her thoughts. Maya realized with growing terror that the train didn't just feed on memories. It used them to pull her deeper, shaping the journey to capture her entirely, body, mind, and soul. Outside, the darkness stretched endlessly, And for the first time, she understood the train had no destination except to contain her forever. By the 10th hour, Maya could no longer distinguish one carriage from another. The train seemed to stretch endlessly, aisles looping impossibly, doors leading to spaces that shouldn't exist. Every time she tried to stand, the aisle seemed longer than before. When she turned, she was back where she had started, the same passengers staring at her, unblinking, patient, eternal. Her reflection in the window had changed again. Now she saw herself older, weary, and terrified, though she knew only minutes had passed. The child at the window mimicked her movements perfectly, yet just slightly off. An echo of her body she could not escape. Whispers threaded through her mind, insistent, layered, impossible to ignore. Observe, obey, integrate. The journey is yours forever. She raised her camera, hoping to capture proof, but every image was distorted. Figures pressed unnaturally close, reflections that didn't match reality, angles that defied physics. Maya sank into her seat. Every instinct screamed to leave, to escape, but she realized the truth. The train had already claimed her. The journey was no longer a ride. It was her reality. By the 11th hour, the train seemed alive with whispers of her past. Voices called her name from the shadows, familiar yet distant. Her mother, a childhood friend, a teacher she had once admired. Some voices were kind, some cruel, but all carried the weight of memories she had long tried to forget. The passengers no longer needed to move. Their awareness was palpable. The man in the dark coat seemed to watch her from everywhere at once, while the child at the window mimicked her emotions perfectly, laughing when she laughed, frowning when she shivered. The reflections in the glass grew more unnerving. Each one showed a version of herself she did not recognize. Older, exhausted, with haunted eyes, younger, terrified, as if trapped in another timeline. A distorted hybrid of both, moving independently. The whispers now commanded, threading directly into her mind. You belong. Your memories are ours. The journey is eternal. Maya understood fully. She was no longer a traveler. She was part of the train, her memories and identity woven into its endless corridors, loops and shadows. And outside, the night stretched on endlessly, with no station to save her. By the 12th hour, Maya could no longer tell where the train ended, and she began. Aisles twisted impossibly, looping back on themselves. Seats shifted subtly when she wasn't looking. Every reflection in the windows showed her slightly older, slightly changed, as if the train were stretching time itself to absorb her. The passengers no longer just watched. They interacted with her, mirroring her movements, predicting her gestures, and sometimes reacting before she could even think. Outside, towns appeared and vanished, stations flickered in and out of existence, and the fog seemed alive, curling around the train as though it knew her thoughts. The whispers were insistent, unavoidable. Observe, obey, integrate, belong. The journey never ends. Every photograph she tried to take revealed the same horrifying truth. The train was recording her, shaping reality to include her, bending space, time, and memory to trap her fully. Maya's heartbeat quickened. She realized the truth. There was no escape. The train was no longer a vehicle. It was a living corridor of memories, and she had become part of it. By the 13th hour, Maya's reflections had multiplied. Every window became a mirror, showing dozens of versions of herself. Some versions were smiling faintly, others crying silently, some moving independently, as if they had lives of their own. The child at the window now had a twin, or perhaps a reflection, leaning closer, eyes unblinking, mimicking her gestures exactly, but with a slight delay. The man in the dark coat appeared in every aisle at once, always watching, always patient. The train itself had grown stranger. Each carriage seemed slightly different, with doors leading to corridors that looped impossibly. Shadows stretched in impossible angles, curling around her, but never touching, just observing, waiting. The whispers were no longer gentle. Observe, remember, obey, integrate. You belong here forever. Maya's camera revealed the most terrifying truth. The train was absorbing her, weaving her presence into its reality. Every movement, every thought, every memory was now part of the train itself. Outside, the night remained endless. There was no station. There was no dawn. She was trapped. By the 14th hour, Maya felt the train inside her mind. It was no longer just the reflections, the passengers, or the endless carriages. Every memory she had ever held, joyous, painful, forgotten, was being replayed, twisted, and recorded by the train. Faces from her past appeared in the windows, sometimes whispering, sometimes silent, always watching. The man in the dark coat and the child at the window were no longer separate entities. They had become extensions of the train, guiding her thoughts, reacting to her emotions, pulling her deeper into the corridors of memory. The whispers had become commands, insistent and undeniable. Observe, remember, obey, integrate. Your journey is eternal. She raised her camera one last time. The viewfinder showed herself in dozens of impossible forms, older, younger, distorted, and yet undeniably her. Every image was alive, pulsating with the train's awareness. Maya understood fully. She was no longer simply a passenger. She was part of the train, woven into its endless journey, every memory she had ever had feeding the rhythm of its motion. Outside, the night stretched endlessly. There would be no dawn. There would be no station. She belonged to the train now. By the 15th hour, Maya's sense of self had begun to fracture. The train was no longer merely a vehicle. It was her reality. The aisles, the passengers, the reflections, the whispers, all were extensions of her own mind, yet controlled by something older, patient, and eternal. Her reflections in the windows moved independently, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying, sometimes watching her with eyes she didn't recognize. The child at the window mirrored every subtle emotion. The man in the dark coat seemed present everywhere at once, always waiting. The whispers threaded through her mind like roots. You are recorded. You are integrated. You belong. The journey is eternal. Maya tried to speak, to call for help, but her voice sounded distant, as if swallowed by the train itself. Every photograph, every attempt to capture the impossible only confirmed what she had begun to understand. She was no longer traveling. She was the train. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, the fog curling infinitely around the rails. Stations appeared and vanished. Towns flickered impossibly, and the passengers, or fragments of her own mind, watched silently. The journey had no end, and it would never let her go. By the 16th hour, Maya's memories were no longer hers alone. The train had absorbed them, every fear, every joy, every regret. They pulsed through the carriages like a living network, visible in reflections, shadows, and whispers. Even the aisles seemed to bend toward her thoughts, guiding her through loops she could not escape. The passengers, or echoes of them, no longer looked like strangers. They were fragments of everyone who had ever boarded this train, blended with pieces of Maya herself, watching, waiting, reminding her that she belonged to the journey. Her camera, once a tool for evidence, now showed only distortions, faces shifting in impossible ways, reflections of herself older, younger, and twisted, all simultaneously real. The whispers were insistent, threading into her consciousness. Observe, integrate, become, eternal. Maya felt a strange clarity amidst the terror. She was no longer fighting. The train had claimed her completely. She had become both traveler and path, memory and motion, observer and observed. Outside, the night continued, infinite and unyielding. The train waited, patient, for the next passenger. By the 17th hour, Maya no longer recognized herself. The train's corridors had become endless loops. Reflections multiplied infinitely, and the passengers had become extensions of her own mind, reacting to thoughts she hadn't yet formed. Shadows stretched along the walls, curling toward her, yet never touching, as if testing her. The whispers were now a constant presence, threading through every memory and emotion. You belong. Every thought is recorded, integration complete. The journey never ends. She glanced at the window. Outside, towns appeared and vanished. Platforms flickered like fading dreams. Faces she knew from her past, friends, family, strangers, appeared briefly, then disappeared, leaving only the sense of being watched, measured, absorbed. The child at the window mimicked her heartbeat. The man in the dark coat seemed to occupy every aisle at once. Every motion she made, every glance, every memory was now woven into the train itself. Maya understood fully. She had become part of something eternal, a living record within a machine that could never let her leave. The night stretched endlessly. Outside, the world waited, but inside, the train held everything and everyone forever. By the 18th hour, Maya had completely merged with the train. She could no longer distinguish her thoughts from the train's rhythm. Every memory, every fear, every fragment of her consciousness flowed through the carriages, reflected in the windows, mirrored in the shadows, whispered by the echoes of passengers who were hers and not hers at the same time. The man in the dark coat was everywhere. The child at the window mimicked her perfectly. Reflections of herself moved independently, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying, sometimes watching her with cold, alien understanding. The whispers had ceased as voices, replaced by a steady hum, pulsing in time with her heartbeat and the train's wheels. You are recorded. You are integrated. The journey is eternal. Maya realized she had no past, no future, no outside world. She was the train, and the train was her. Every passenger she had seen, every station that appeared and vanished, every reflection was now a part of her, woven into the fabric of this endless journey. Outside, the night stretched infinitely, but inside, the train moved steadily, patiently, eternally, waiting, always waiting for the next passenger.